Trying to destroy you.
All right. For those of you watching from home, the reason this is shorter is we've gone over an exam, so this video will be shorter than usual. Where are we in class right now? We are focusing on the fourth set of chapters that are going to be due this Sunday. We spent the last couple of classes playing the imbalanced trading card game, thus the lack of videos over the last couple of days. But we are getting a bit better of a sense of how this game feels to play. I posted a discussion board post on Canvas that is the table from yesterday where we were keeping track of the cumulative deck versus deck stats. If you continue to play with these base rules and these base decks, feel free to post to that discussion with the results of what you played, and I will update the table as we collect more information, and that can be used just class-wide to get a sense of how imbalanced are these, where are those imbalances. So as we continue to talk and do a couple more not as related activities, what you should be thinking about moving forward is what changes can we make to these decks with the eventual goal of having them being all balanced against each other without really changing the identities too much of the decks. We want them to feel different. We don't want them to feel like 4 copies of the same deck. So trying to keep them feeling distinguished, but also balanced against each other to have an equal chance to win. What would that look like? As you think about that over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be starting to dive into a big unit, very big unit that will cover many actual lectures and lecture sequences on game balance, because balancing games is one of the most challenging things for game designers. We can all come up with a spark for an idea of a game that we want to make, but actually taking that idea, turning it into a game, and then turning that idea into something that feels balanced, feels the appropriate difficulty, gets the players in that flow zone that we talked about. That is very important, and it's something that computer scientists tend to run away a little bit from, because it involves some math. So let's just kind of start to think about that in general. So how could we define game balance succinctly? I think tying it back to flow is important, to say that as frequently as possible, a game is balanced if every player who is playing it is in this flow zone. Now, of course, how do we measure it? So thinking about collecting data that would allow us to even answer the question, is a game balanced? What do we do? Thoughts on that?
Track player retention and see if there's a specific point where they just leave.
Yeah, player retention is a very important part of this. If someone stops playing your game, there's usually a reason why they have stopped playing your game. Do you get that just off of the player retention? Is there any way that you could get additional information when a player leaves your game?
Review.
I would try to track like statistics, kind of like what we're doing with the card game, like
Yeah.
measuring which decks are won against which decks and which ones lose, and
What kinds of biases exist in that data? Yeah, we don't really have a measurement for how good players were when they played those decks. There's no real way to tell what people have learned when they play those games. If we get 3 different results from the same pair of players, did one person learn more than the other person as they played those games together? That's obfuscated throughout the data that we're collecting. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a very difficult question to answer, and we also have to acknowledge the biases in our data, knowing that they are there, and they may change how we want to deal with this data. Other ideas? What else can we collect? I heard reviews. Reviews is good.
If you have a game that's character-based, you can record which characters are being played the most.
Sure.
And look at the characters that are not being played the most and figure out a way to make them more enjoyable so other people can play.
Yeah. It could just be that you look at the art and the art doesn't look appealing for this particular character class. It could be that the skills are imbalanced. It could be that ranged is just better than melee with the mechanics that you have, and you need to buff this entire not just the skills, but the concept of how far away can a melee character hit from. How tanky is a melee character in general to make up for the damage they have to absorb by being close to enemies.
In the case of the, card game, theoretically, you can take data even on like the entire game, keep track over time of how many cards are in the deck, how many cards are in the deck, and how many cards are in the discard pile, and how do those three altogether change over time?
Okay. Yeah, actually looking at and collecting data on each game, not just the outcome of each game, but the actual progression through each game. That may allow you to do something like assign a score to each player, how effectively they played the game. If you could have some metric for calculating, given a particular state and full information, what was the right play? Was there a right play? Were there some plays that were better than others? How frequently did that player play a good move versus a great move versus a genius move versus a move that caused them to lose the game? So we could use that to find ways to rank players and or to determine the quality of players. We'll actually dive into that later in this course.
I would look at where people quit or stop playing.
Yeah,
That would maybe lead me to a root cause of maybe a place where difficulty level is not balanced or.
okay, so even just looking at what is the last thing they did in the game before they quit and keeping stats on that. It'd be nice if we could talk to them, but if they've quit a game, they're probably not willing to fill out a survey or something of the sort about how they quit. They're probably just done, especially if they're frustrated. They don't really feel like they owe you anything.
Seem like the reviews.
Yeah, look at the negative reviews for why they pointed out reasons. All good ideas. Does balance mean the same thing to everyone? We've kind of addressed this a little bit in that, no, people have different flow zones at different places, at different points in time. What's going to be fun to one person at one point in time is not necessarily the same as what's going to be fun for someone else. But balanced could possibly mean the same thing to everyone. If we were to abstract from exactly the level of difficulty, if a game is balanced, is everyone going to think that it's balanced? So I harken back to the StarCraft 1 days, for instance. That is known as one of the most balanced games of all time, because regardless of your skill level, if you were a novice, how novices played the game, the three factions had close to equal win rates against each other. As you scaled up and this became your life, it was still balanced. It had equal win rates across, which is incredibly difficult to do. But would everyone who plays StarCraft 1 enough to be able to answer the question, is this game balanced? Would they all say yes? What would cause someone to be able to say no, or to say no, in a game that has historically been considered to be balanced? Yeah.
I was thinking some of the games right now, like Marvel Rifles was the first thing that popped in my head. They have characters where they tell you like, this is more for beginners, this is more for experts, but it doesn't actually matter. You can do whatever. So like, even if you're an expert, you do an easy character, you can do things that a beginner will not know how to do on that character.
Right. Yeah.
So balance is kind of a mess for them.
Yeah. Yeah. You can certainly have a more beginner-friendly layout and a more expert-friendly layout. It doesn't really tell you too much about the overall power of those characters. It just says, how well do you need to know the mechanics of the game and the controls and your options at every point in time to be able to effectively use that character? Yeah.
How do you like mediate like let's use StarCraft as the example, because back in the day I played StarCraft. Like if I got into a lobby with someone that was just insane and I got wrecked, how do you avoid like me saying like, oh, like, you know, Zerg is trash, but it was just because I sucked with Zerg. It's like, oh, I'm like complaining that it's not balanced, but I'm really just not like using the meta.
Yeah, that's one interesting way to think about the problem. Is someone who loses the game, is that inherently cause imbalance?
There has to be a winner and a loser.
Right. right? There has to be a winner and a loser. So depending on one person's small sample size, even if it's a coin flip each time you play, every once in a while, someone's going to lose 7 games in a row or win 7 games in a row just by pure chance. It's going to feel like the game is out to get you, and that may cause them to quit and leave a review. But you, the developer, also need to collect that data to know that even if it's a coin flip, someone's going to lose 7 times in a row. That doesn't mean that there's an imbalance, even if every single negative review points that out. If it's 1 in 64 people who played the game have that concern, then you would expect about 1 in 64 to have 7 flips in a row that show up the same value. So you can start to look at it in terms of what is the proportion of the player base that has this concern. Oh, look, it maps to the exact probability that it lines up with. So I don't think there's actually an issue here.
Do slot games and like casino games follow these same sort of rules?
Yeah, you can.
Is there
I think the machine is bad if you lose a bunch, but maybe that's just chance. Having an understanding of probability and an understanding of chance allows you to be able to distinguish between something that is expected and something that is not expected. If your game is performing in a way that it is not what you expect, then there's an underlying bug or there's an underlying balance issue. If it is, maybe there's still an issue with the design, but it is performing the way that you intended given its design. Being able to know that for sure is a mathematical question. So we can ask things like, what variables do we have control over? If we say the game that you produced is imbalanced, what options do you have? What can you latch onto as something that you could tweak? Change a little bit.
And on the game, like our card deck game, we could take some of the healing out of A, so it's not super overpowered with healing.
Yeah, any of the mechanics, sure.
You could also, add things that could throw a wrench into it that could potentially have a way to come back or subvert that tactic players use it.
Change mechanics, add mechanics, remove mechanics. What else?
Change any values, so like, for the deck example, like you're gonna have a 1 cost that heals 4, well, you can change it to where it heals 2 instead of 4.
How does that change the rest of the balance? So if you think of the game as one big whole, and you're looking at a small piece of this, recognizing there's an imbalance between this section and that section. If you make a numeric change,
Then affect all the other things.
anything that depends on. Fixing one issue may create more issues. How do you analyze a game in such a way where you can know that the changes you're going to make aren't going to continue to perforate to the rest of the mechanics, to the rest of the interactions in the game? I'm not expecting people to have answers to this, but it's things that we should be thinking about as we start to think about game balance. The rest of this will answer a lot of those questions. But yeah, idea?
I would guess you would make the change and test it, test it, test it.
Yeah, you don't necessarily know going in exactly how it's going to affect the game, but you might have a better idea if you have a better underlying understanding of the math behind your game. You might be able to say, all right, this is a function that does this, this is a function that does this. When we overlap them, here are the places where these functions differ from each other for so much. So what options do I have for changing not just this one number, but the entire progression of numbers so that it doesn't change it where it's not imbalanced, but it does change it where it is imbalanced? So thinking about your game, not just from a I'm playing it perspective, but from the underlying, what's the shape of the mechanics? What is the mathematical shape of this game? That can change a lot. So knowing this is a gray area, there's no right and wrong answer. Really, in a particular game, you have to analyze each game as itself, those mechanics as themselves, but there are some common tools that we can use that will be relevant in multiple places. So it's also contextually sensitive, we know this. Kinds of game balance. We will start with mathematical balance. So things that you can affect, things like the level curve, the cost of any items in your game, Any hit points on any characters and or enemies? Item rarity and scarcity. How are you going to understand something like mathematical balance? Well, we need to now understand how each of these mechanics relate to each other at some scale. We need to be able to map them to functions, to rates of growth, to something that allows you to be able to say, how does this change with time? How does this change time in the game, player experience? We also need to understand probability and conditional probability. So any kind of binomial combinatorics, any kind of Bayes theorem, all of those come back and are especially useful as you're starting to think about games and mechanics within games. We'll get to cost curves. That's something we're going to focus on in detail. And just statistics in general. So this will be applying a lot of the math that you've seen before. Turns out to be a very fun application of it too. You can balance the difficulty. So the difficulty by itself, difficulty curve is just a numerical function of how that difficulty changes over time. And of course, then we can divide it by the player skill or the anticipated player skill so that we can get something that is close to, but not exactly 1. If we assume that 1 is, this quotient of 1 is the flow zone, then being able to map difficulty divided by player skill should get something that is fairly consistent across the entire time, where you would get something where there are maybe some bumps where there are boss fights. Boss fights are more difficult than the average encounter. And maybe there are some dips in that to allow for the player to farm up or to catch up if they're a little bit weaker. Now there are some particular enemy types that they can defeat, gain experience, and now they can defeat the more difficult. But thinking about it as a quotient or a ratio will certainly help with that. If we don't have big differences between the game's challenge and the player's skill, the player is in that flow zone. They're having fun, they're feeling powerful, the game is balanced. So ways we can break balance, if you have a bad difficulty spike where the one aspect of a game is way more challenging, maybe it's a particular boss encounter, maybe it's a particular enemy type, maybe it's a long stretch where you cannot heal your party. Also, of course, conditional on the target audience. Is the target audience children? Children don't have the same ability to grow in player skill that college students do in general. We can't really talk about difficulty without talking about Souls-likes or masochistic players who really get a lot of value out of overcoming a nearly impossible challenge or a very difficult challenge. So how does that fit into this discussion? I think the answer is that the flow zone for a player like that is very different. It's higher on the difficulty side. Yeah.
It seems like those kind of games, the difficulty level is just where it is, and they just want your skill to get up there.
Yeah, that changes the target audience. The target audience is not the general public. It's people who want that challenge. Yeah.
Meaning that I think any Souls was born style of game is a really good example of, it's less about simply just growing yourself, but finding a way to navigate and circumvent a lot of the game's challenges that it unapologetically has.
Yeah, that is true.
Including the camera and any of its numerous bugs.
Right.
Just add to the experience.
Not a bug, it's a feature.
Another extreme example would be something like roguelikes. So the roguelike genre has players playing as a character, and at the end of a run of that character, the game is over, and so is that character. You must start over from scratch with minimal amounts of progression aside from the skill that you developed from your last character. What did you learn from your last run? What did you learn about the game? How can you use that information to make the next run better? How does that difficulty, so the game's difficulty doesn't really change too much, But as the progression that the player feels is solely based on the player's skill evolving. Yeah,
I think the flow state for roguelikes is a little different than other games because you're constantly doing this thing of like, should I just start over or should I play this run out? Until the
Yeah.
end? So it's almost more of a less challenge, more, oh, do I want to do something different type of thing.
yeah, that can certainly be, I want to try what I just did with a very different character class, very different experience. But as you get more skilled, you can push through more content and more content. But you have to replay all of that early content to get to that point. Some people are all for that, some people are not. You can have roguelites where there is meta progression at the end of each run. You can improve general abilities to make the next run easier, so you can push a little bit further before you die, get some upgrades, something like that. How about cozy games?
Fire Ranger.
Yeah.
Exactly what I was thinking.
So it very much depends on the target audience, right? These are very different types of players. Cozy game players usually aren't looking for a big challenge.
Unless they're speedrunners.
You can speed run just about anything, right? You can turn anything into a competitive game, including finishing cozy games. Yeah,
I think to differ, Stardew Valley's fishing is horrible.
I love the fishing. What are you talking about? Fishing's the best part.
That's
It makes so much money.
Stardew Valley is surprisingly stressful for a cozy game.
you're right.
The game with Minecraft.
Yeah. So there's different levels of cozy game that will target different levels of cozy gamers. But in general, the difficulty in a cozy game is supposed to be ramped down to make it more about the experience of playing it. So last question we can ask before we're out of time. Thinking historically, how has the target difficulty of games changed over the last years or decades? Yeah,
I think in the general populace, it's gone away from that more Souls-like thesis of this is the difficulty the player has to figure out how to, solve it. It's
Yeah.
more, okay, here's what your skill level will help you progress along, and then we'll ramp it up as we see you getting more skill.
yeah,
I remember back in like the Nintendo / Sega Genesis time, like when
Yeah.
games were like, some of them were impossible, some of them were
Brutally
really
hard.
Like people go play, one of the premier examples I can think about is like the Super Nintendo Sega Genesis Lion King game. And it was like notoriously difficult.
Yeah.
And I never beat it as
Yeah.
a kid. And so I feel like games started off being really difficult. Probably because there were so few games and people had to kind of play out over time
Yeah.
one game, and then games kind of got more approachable. And I would still argue that games are more approachable than they've ever been, but also we're seeing kind of this return to difficulty almost.
yeah, but it has its own subgenre,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of the development of Souls-like games harkening back to 90s style. If you want to see this in just a couple of games, spend half an hour playing both Elder Scrolls Arena and Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Just compare and contrast the opening 30 minutes to an hour of both of those games, and you will see exactly how games and their target audiences have changed. It's very apparent very early on from games in the same series. Yeah.
I feel like that's in a large part of it, having a lot more tools they can use to influence the feelings of the players. Like, you look at those old NES arcade era games, they really didn't have that many capabilities to deliver
Right.
stories and emotion. So the only way they could really influence the player was by changing the difficulty.
Right.
Modern games, there's just such a wider array of different ways that a game can do things, that it's not, that difficulty isn't the only tool we have anymore.
I would argue it boils down to, I'll conclude this on, I think it boils down to games are more accessible now. And the reason we want as many people as possible playing games. Games in the 90s and earlier were designed for a particular niche, a particular audience of hardcore gamers who liked playing games. But as this has become a wider field targeting just about everybody in some way, shape, or form, that's why the game landscape has evolved in so many different, very different directions. So we'll come back and talk more about balance and start up hopefully tomorrow with our next activity, which will be playing a game and trying to understand its mathematical shape. I'll see you tomorrow for that.